Chapter 7. The fateful day dawned bright and clear. It was late November, and Elizabeth was surprised to see the weather holding so well. It was uncommonly fine, and she hoped it held long enough for everyone to travel as planned. It had been arranged that her parents would be heading home to their own estate at about the same time that Elizabeth and the Earl would be leaving for Heath. Elizabeth felt a pang at the thought of not being in her own home for the first time in her life. She knew it was the normal turn of events, and she should have been expecting it, but she had, of course, always expected a trifle more time to prepare. Meeting and marrying one's mate within a 9-day period was monstrously disconcerting. She rolled her eyes at her reflection of the ludicrous thought. Having been left alone for a moment, she was glad for the reprieve. Elizabeth was dressed, as the Earl had requested, in a lovely green gown, and her hair was arranged in what appeared to be the exact same style as that fateful night. Seeing the hectic colour high on her cheeks, she was glad to see she was not as pale as she would have expected, given how very nervous she was. She was about to vow her life to a man she didn't trust. A man she feared had murdered his first wife. It was rather farcical that she also found that very same man to be so ridiculously appealing. Not only was he one of the most handsome men she had ever laid her eyes upon, but he was also interesting, kind, and attentive. Butterflies launched themselves into formation in her belly once more, and she wondered if it had been wise to eat that morning. It was a relief when Pansy bustled back into the room. She had been busy finishing up Elizabeth's packing for the move to Heath. All the arrangements had been made. As soon as the marriage was performed, there would be a wedding breakfast, and then they would be on the road to the Earl's country estate. Within a few short hours, Elizabeth would be irretrievably locked into this future. She shoved the disquieting thoughts once more from her mind. Within what felt like the blink of an eye, she was bundled up into the Earl's carriage, and they were on their way. Her maid and his valet had already left with their luggage, sometime during the festivities. Elizabeth was a tangle of nerves, but was doing her best to mask just how very terrified she was. She truly did not want her new husband to think she was a simpleton. Justice watched his new wife chew nervously on her lip. She sat stiffly beside him, clasping her hands together, so tightly her knuckles were turning white. Even a complete clod would be able to tell she was terrified, even if they couldn't sense the waves of fear emanating from her. He wondered rather desperately how to put her at ease. He thought distracting her with conversation might help. "Did everything go as you had hoped?" The look of incredulity that crossed her face almost made him laugh at his own ridiculous question. Of course it was not what she had hoped. She had hoped to either make a love match, or to remain blissfully unmarried to set up her own establishment when she reached the age of majority. She was getting neither of her wished-for options. Perhaps that was not properly phrased. I guess what I meant to say was, the arrangements seem to have gone off smoothly. That is true, my lord, and my mother is quite happy. Justice was relieved to see a small smile on her face. At least the young woman who was now his wife had a sense of humour. He really enjoyed that about her. Unlike his first wife, he shoved all thoughts of Barbara from his mind as best he could. It was difficult not to compare. Elizabeth was such a breath of fresh air and showed to advantage over Barbara in every way. He must never forget how fortunate he was. He struggled to think of something else to discuss, but really they knew so little about each other. It would be productive to use this time to rectify that, but seeing how brittle she looked, wreathed in fear, he drew a blank as to how to proceed. Castigating himself as every manner of fool, he turned to her to set her mind at ease on at least one subject that he was certain she would be concerned about. "I noticed your reaction a few days ago when I mentioned the possibility of you sharing my rooms while yours are being completed," he began. He was amazed at the stillness that came over her, as though she were making a concerted effort not to react to his words. "Did you, my lord?" she asked, without revealing her thoughts. "I know you had wished for a love match, my dear, and I am sorry that our circumstances have not been ideal. I hope that we will, with time, grow an affection for one another." He paused again, hoping for some sort of reaction from her. He had to be satisfied with her words. That would be ideal, would it not? Her tone revealed very little, but from her stillness he surmised that the conversation was making her even more uptight. So he rushed into further speech. "I am certain your mother has explained to you about my need for an heir, and how we would go about accomplishing that?" He paused briefly, uncomfortable himself with the conversation, but slightly mollified by the hot colour rising in his wife's cheeks. "But I think it would be best if we wait a while, to allow you a little more time to get used to the idea." Her eyes widened at his words, and he could see her mulling over his words. "How long might a while be, my lord?" Justice had to laugh over her question. "I cannot say for sure, my lady. I dare say we will know when the time is right." At her sceptical glance, he laughed again before continuing. "Let us say at least a few days, or even a couple of weeks. I doubt I will be able to wait any longer than that, but I want you to be comfortable in your new home. I am quite well aware of the fact that this is not the situation you had wished for." He watched as a myriad of emotions chased each other across her expressive face. Finally she replied, "I appreciate your consideration, my lord." She had nothing further to add, merely sitting beside him, almost vibrating with attention. Finally, with a soft sigh, he proposed a game of cards to pass the time. His bride looked relieved and happily accepted. After that, the time passed quickly. The distraction of the game loosened Elizabeth's tongue, and before long they were conversing almost comfortably. "Could you tell me a little bit about your estate before we get there?" she shyly asked. "What would you like to know?" "Well, everything," she replied with a small laugh. "But you could start with how big it is, what kind of crops do you raise? Do you have any mining on your estate? And you never did end up telling me about the neighbours. Will I know anyone nearby? And I apologize, but I am directionally challenged. How far will we be from my family? Will we be able to visit occasionally, or will it take an arduous trip to get there?" The Earl laughed and set himself to the task of assuaging her curiosity. "We should get to Heath within 2 or 3 hours. We are travelling west, while your parents will be travelling northeast. It will take us a long day of travel to get from Heath to your family's estate, so we should be able to do it on occasion. I am a busy man with much to do and accomplish, but I promise that I will take you at least once a year to have a visit with your family. And, of course, any of them will be welcome in our home whenever they would like to visit you." He could see that his answer pleased her by the smile and blush that briefly suffused her face. "I shan't bore you with too many details right now. I would much rather show you around so you can see for yourself. But I hope you will forgive my pride when I say that Heath is a magnificent estate." Justice was glad to see that his wife's sense of humour was regaining its strength when she giggled over his words. He continued his description. "It is the biggest estate in the area. As such, I have many dependents. The tenant farmers rely on my steward's direction and suggestions. My own workers raise the crops to keep our animals fed. We have sheep for wool. We do have some mining, both tin and coal. It's dirty work, I must say, so I am of two minds on the matter, but it is highly profitable. So for now it shall continue. I don't want you getting too close to the mines, my lady." "Why ever not?" She appeared offended. "I mean no offence, my lady. It is merely that it is not the safest place. I would hate for something to happen to you." An unidentifiable emotion crossed her face, as though she didn't quite believe him. Justice decided to leave that argument for another day, and hoped to distract her by answering another one of her questions. "As to our neighbours, I think you will be able to make friends with the gentry nearby. I'm not really sure who you've met, but I know everyone will be happy to meet you and will welcome you into the local society. Do you think they will have heard already that we are married? I did send notices to the paper, so word should have spread, even with how fast things have proceeded for us. I am certain you shall have collars within days of our arrival." He wasn't sure why his words had caused his wife to look so relieved, but he surmised that she was worried about feeling lonely. "I'll try not to be so busy that you are bored, my dear. And you shall have plenty to do in helping me, if you would like, so I don't think you need fear being lonely at Heath." She cast him a look of eager anticipation. "You would have me help you? What kind of help could I give you?" He countered with a question of his own. "Did your mother not help your father on their estate?" Elizabeth sat and thought, with her cute little nose wrinkled. "Well, she ran the household and visited the tenants. Is that what you mean?" "That is part of it, of course. I will surely appreciate your help in that regard, if you are willing to give it." He was happy to see her nod, as though it was obvious she would do those things. But it would also be lovely to have someone to discuss things with and help with decisions. A partner, as it were. She cocked her head with a curious look. I would like to think you would feel able to discuss anything with me, my lord. I cannot guarantee I will have sufficient knowledge on any particular subject to have an opinion to offer, but I am eager to learn. I hadn't thought of the possibility of being partners. Not even with a love match you would imagine for yourself? That idea was always rather nebulous, my lord. I do believe I was much more enamoured with the idea of setting up my own establishment. Her cheeky grin took the sting out of her words, but he still drawled, I hope you will be able to live with the disappointment. He didn't understand the strange look that crossed her face, nor her comment. I do look forward to living. But he did not press her for an explanation. They were nearing his house, and he was eager to see her reaction. Elizabeth peered from the window as the main house came into view when they broke through the trees that lined the long driveway. The well-groomed lawns stretched wide, leaving the slightly austere three-story building standing firm and solitary. She quite liked how solid it looked, especially with the glimpses of orchards well past the house. What looked like an orangery was visible in the distance, although in her biased opinion Castleton looked slightly more inviting. Heath looked prosperous and well cared for, and it looked like the wings of the house spread out endlessly. Elizabeth wondered, a little desperately, how long it would take her to be able to learn her way around the large dwelling. She reminded herself that she had grown up in similar surroundings. I will be fine, she repeated silently, like a mantra. She had grown up in an earl's household, so her social standing had changed little. It was a comfort to her that she had been well trained for the role she was entering. Lord Sinclair had sent word for his household to expect his arrival with his new wife, and as soon as their carriage was spotted, the staff had assembled to welcome them. Elizabeth's energy was waning after the long day, and she dearly hoped she would be able to remember the names being said to her in rapid succession. She suspected she was going to have trouble matching the faces to the names over the next few days. She hoped Pansy would be able to help her rehearse. It would not endear her to her new household if she could not keep their names straight. The butler and housekeeper were a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Patrick. They would be the members of the staff she would work with most closely, and Elizabeth hoped to make a good first impression. She smiled warmly as they welcomed her to her new home. "Oh, dearie, we're right glad to have you. It's about time we have a proper mistress. Whatever you need, you be sure to tell us, and we'll do our level best to see to your comfort." Elizabeth was surprised to feel tears prick at the back of her eyes, and had to clear her throat before thanking her. "I look forward to working with you, Mrs. Patrick." "Mrs. Patrick, would you be so kind as to show Lady Elizabeth to her room, so she can freshen up while I confer with Mr. Patrick?" the Earl had asked. "It would be my pleasure. Come along, dearie." The housekeeper suited her words to action and escorted Elizabeth through the large house, showing her some of the rooms and chattering along the way. "Down that hallway is the master's library, and the breakfast room." She indicated two of the doors that Elizabeth could see standing ajar. She was curious which rooms the other doors led to, but didn't bother asking, certain that over the coming days all those types of questions would be answered. As they climbed the stairs, Mrs. Patrick continued to talk, although her voice was coming in bursts as the climb was making her short of breath. "The master instructed that your things be placed in the room across the hall from his own, since your suite is still torn apart. I do apologize, my lady. We ought to have ensured that the work was finished up before his lordship took a new wife." Elizabeth was quick to reassure the housekeeper. "Oh, no apology is necessary, Mrs. Patrick. I am actually rather excited about the prospect of overseeing the finishing of the project. This way, I can make it my very own space." "Well, dearie, that's a mighty fine way of looking at it." Mrs. Patrick stopped to smile at her new mistress and catch her breath as they reached the top of the stairs. After a moment, they continued down the hallway. "Your maid and the master's valet arrived about an hour ago, and your Pansy has been busy getting your things arranged. I do hope you will be comfortable in here." "I am sure it shall be lovely," Elizabeth answered politely. Mrs. Patrick shot her a quizzical glance. "The master certainly made a better choice this time." Elizabeth could feel a blush rising to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and gratification, making her feel at a loss for words. She was saved from having to say anything as they had reached the end of the hall. "Here we are, my lady. His lordship's room is just there." She indicated the door on the right. "And this here will be yours for now." Mrs. Patrick opened the door into a most contradictory sight. Elizabeth did her best to keep a pleasant smile on her face. It was a large room, with several large windows providing a good amount of natural light. This was pretty much where the good points ended. The wallpaper, window coverings, and furniture were all showing signs of age and wear. They were very dark and heavy, not at all to Elizabeth's taste. But she could see that the housekeeper was looking at her expectantly. Elizabeth scrambled to find something to say. "Thank you, Mrs. Patrick. It looks as though your staff has done an excellent job of keeping this room clean. The large windows are delightful. It will be lovely to be able to wake up to so much light in the morning." Mrs. Patrick beamed at her, clapping her hands. "Oh, my lady, I am right glad that you like it. We are just so happy to have you here. I'll leave you now to have a little rest, but you'll just ring if you need anything at all." "Thank you, Mrs. Patrick." Elizabeth was looking forward to having a few quiet moments to herself with the comforting presence of her own maid, who had bowed a curtsy when they entered, but remained where she was across the room, hanging things in the wardrobe. As the door shut behind the housekeeper, Pansy spoke for the first time. "How are you holding up, my lady?" She looked a little worried. Elizabeth tried to smile at her, but she felt that it was probably looking as slumped as she felt. She sank onto a stool that was conveniently placed near the door. "I will be fine after a little nap, or a good meal. Or both," she concluded with a small laugh. "It looks like you have been hard at work." There were empty bandboxes piled up next to the open trunk. "I had hoped to have it all finished before you got here, but we must not have gotten as big of a head start as I had thought. The Earl wanted to be sure that we would arrive before dark, so we didn't dither about our goodbyes as long as I would have liked." "Are you feeling homesick already, my lady?" Pansy asked with concern. "Not terribly yet, Pansy, but I am feeling nervous." "Well, my lady, one thing I can tell you is that your new husband is very well spoken of within his household. I know I have just gotten here, but all the other servants have had nothing but good things to say about him. I would think if you had something to fear, at least one of the others would have warned me in some way." "Would they?" Elizabeth countered. "Or if they were truly fearful, would they keep silent for fear that their words might get back to him in some way?" "Perhaps, my lady. I can't see how you could think that. But I have also heard some of the servants whistling. If the household lived in dread of a tyrannical master, I rather doubt there would be any whistling, especially with him expected." Elizabeth pondered the maid's words and brightened considerably. "Thank you, Pansy. You are right. That does make me feel more hopeful. But we really have to find out how the previous Countess died. Do you think you could try to ask a few discreet questions?" "Absolutely, my lady. You can count on me." "I know I can, Pansy, and it is of supreme comfort to me." "Why don't you ever lie down for a few minutes while I finish up here? Then we'll get you ready for your first supper in your new home." Elizabeth looked at the bed, not finding it at all welcoming. Her thoughts must have been written on her face. "It doesn't look very good, my lady, but I took the liberty of checking the sheets for cleanliness, and it looks as though the mattress has been recently aired. The sheets are clean, and the bed feels quite comfortable. I think you should try it out and see." Elizabeth didn't bother replying. She just did as the maid suggested, ignoring the look of the furniture and making use of it. Pansy had been right. It did smell fresh and clean, and it was incredibly comfortable and solid after the long swaying ride in the carriage. Within an instant, Elizabeth was able to shed the concerns and stresses of the day and fall into a deep, blessedly dreamless sleep. She awoke with a start to the soft sound of her maid calling to her. "Lady Elizabeth, you shouldn't sleep much longer or you won't be able to sleep tonight. I'm sure his lordship is going to be wondering what has become of you if you don't get yourself up and go down for a bite to eat." Elizabeth groaned, but obeyed the summons. "You are probably right, Pansy, but at this moment I feel as though I could sleep until the middle of the afternoon tomorrow." Despite her protests, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and slid to the floor. And the thought of eating holds very little appeal as well. But you are correct. I should probably go and see what his lordship has to say. The thought of seeing her new husband set her nerves to jangling, but she did her best to quell them as her maid helped her to change into a fresh dress and tidy her hair. She opted for a simple style and was quickly ready. She left the room and strode tentatively toward the stairs, wondering how long it would take her to find her way around the large house. Luckily, it was a well-staffed household, and there were plenty of footmen about to give her directions. "Elizabeth, my dear." The Earl got to his feet as soon as he saw his wife hovering in the doorway. "Come in, please. I wasn't sure if you would be joining me. Your maid had informed me that you were fast asleep when I stopped by your room to check on you." Elizabeth blushed. "Pansy didn't tell me you came to see me, but she woke me up and reminded me that I ought to eat. I'm sorry if you have been inconvenienced." "Not at all. After sitting all day, I didn't feel very hungry, so I asked that we be served a cold collation. I figured that way the timing didn't matter very much, and if you joined me, you joined me. If not, it could be kept for another day." Feeling nervous and on edge, Elizabeth inched into the room. The Earl must have been able to tell because he made an effort to put her at ease. His warm smile and thoughtfulness about the meal had her relaxing slightly as she moved further into the room. She finally made her way to the table where he held a chair for her. After he had returned to his own seat, he continued speaking in a relaxed, informal tone. "I met briefly with my steward and the butler. It has been a couple months since I have been here. I am happy to be able to report that it seems all has been running smoothly. I will have to spend the bulk of tomorrow reviewing the ledgers and records, but Mr. Patrick led me to believe that I shan't be inundated with work, which is a relief. If you feel up to it, perhaps we could go for a ride tomorrow and I could show you some of the estate." Elizabeth was gratified to hear the eager pride in his voice. It was heartwarming to know that her new husband was looking forward to showing off his properties to her. "That sounds like a lovely plan. Thank you, my lord." "Did Mrs. Patrick give you a tour of the house before you laid down?" "An abbreviated one," Elizabeth said with a smile. "She told me she would show me more tomorrow, but I'm not fully convinced she will be able to manage it. The stairs seem to be giving her a bit of trouble." "She will want to show you every cupboard and closet, so the stairs won't be all at once," came the Earl's reasonable reply. "That's true. I look forward to learning everything." They conversed comfortably after that while the footman served them the light meal. When the Earl asked if she was very tired, Elizabeth once again felt nerves shake her, but he merely invited her for a game of checkers before they retired. The next day, true to her word, the housekeeper spent the entire morning touring Elizabeth from the cellars to the attics. The 3 wings of the house left Elizabeth feeling a little dizzy. She had thought she had grown up in grand surroundings, but it was becoming clear to her that Heath was on a scale even she was not fully accustomed to. She tried not to reveal her lack of experience to the housekeeper, as she smiled and nodded in what she expected were all the right places. "It seems to me that this house has been in very good hands with your management, Mrs. Patrick." The housekeeper beamed with pride at her mistress's words. "I have done my level best, my lady, but it is a real pleasure to have someone such as yourself to take over the running of things. And now it seems likely that the master will be in residence more now that he has a good wife, so I will be vastly happy to have your direction." "It looks to me as though you are well prepared and stocked up. You will have to keep me informed as things progress, Mrs. Patrick, especially for things like linens and such. It would not do for them to become worn. We will no doubt have visitors from time to time. I come from a very large family, and I'm sure many of them will wish to visit." "Oh, how exciting!" Mrs. Patrick declared, clapping her hands. "Now come this way, my lady. I haven't yet shown you the nursery. Hopefully soon it will be needed." Elizabeth could feel heat rising in her face, but made no comment as she followed in the housekeeper's wake. At breakfast, the Earl had mentioned he would be free by 2 o'clock to take her riding, so Elizabeth asked a housekeeper to have a tray sent to her room when the tour finally came to an end. She then went up to change into a riding habit. While she was eating her small repast, Elizabeth quietly thought over what she had seen on her tour. The Earl's staff was clearly hard-working. Every room she had entered was clean and well-kept, but most of those rooms were also darkly furnished and outdated, much like the room she was occupying. She could understand now why the Earl had offered to allow her to redecorate. He might have wanted to make her feel at home, but he was also no doubt quite well aware of the need for updates. As he had suggested, She would start with finishing the project the previous Countess had started. Elizabeth had been a bit uncomfortable to come across a room full of that lady's belongings. She was surprised it was all still there. The housekeeper had obviously been embarrassed about it, and Elizabeth had tried to put her at ease, but she felt an intense curiosity about the woman and was actually looking forward to digging through her things, even though she felt a pang of guilt about her plans. Mrs. Patrick had been flustered and hurriedly declared she would have some maid summoned to see to removing the items, but Elizabeth had firmly told her that would not be necessary. Shutting the door firmly, she had told Mrs. Patrick that the things could remain where they were for the time being. She would see to rearranging the rooms in a certain order, and they could deal with that room when they came to it. Mrs. Patrick had accepted her words happily, and the tour had continued. Now Elizabeth began to scheme how she could spend some time in there without anyone finding out. She didn't want the servants speculating about her curiosity, or for the Earl to find out that she was investigating his first wife. She resolved to spend a little time searching after her ride with the Earl. "I apologize, Elizabeth. I will not be able to take you as far afield as I had hoped today. The work with my steward is more complicated than I had at first thought." The Earl's words greeted her as soon as she reached the bottom of the stairs in her riding habit. Elizabeth was surprisingly disappointed, but she tried to save face. "That is quite all right, my lord. If you would rather put it off until another day, I will completely understand." "Not at all, my dear lady. I am growing heartily bored of my library, and desperately need some fresh air. Besides, I would enjoy a little time in your company." Elizabeth's cheeks warmed at his words, and she felt a flutter in her stomach. She frowned to quell her unruly feelings. Her cheeks reddened even further when the Earl misunderstood her frown. "If you would rather not go for an abbreviated ride, then I will understand, of course." The Earl's words sounded stilted, and Elizabeth thought she must have injured his feelings. She couldn't help but giggle at the self-serving thought. "Not at all, my lord. I too am in need of some fresh air, and I would love to see whatever parts of the estate we have time for. If you are pressed for time, let us not tarry." She suited action to her words and preceded him from the room. She faltered at the door as she was unsure in which direction she would find the stables. Now it was the Earl's turn to chuckle. He took her arm. "Right this way, my dear." The stables must have been forewarned, as their horses were already saddled and waiting for them. Within moments they were mounted and on their way. She could feel the Earl's gaze on her, and glanced at him with upraised eyebrows. This prompted a laugh from him, but he also explained himself. "I doubt we have time for any sort of proper tour today, unfortunately. Why don't I show you the outbuildings, so you'll feel comfortable at least close to the house? And then, if you're up for it, let's let the horses have their heads and blow the cobwebs out for ourselves?" "That sounds to me like an excellent plan." It didn't take long for the Earl to point out the various storage buildings, the orchards, and the greenhouses. Off in the distance she could see sheep grazing. She was a little in awe of just how extensive his property was. It would seem that Heath stretched much farther than even the eye could see. Elizabeth did not want to be impressed with her husband while her future remained so uncertain. But it was obvious to her that he was an excellent landlord. Once again she was troubled by her mixed feelings, and was filled with relief when they reached a small rise with a clear vista before them. "First one to the tree line gets to be white in our next chess game," the Earl declared. "Next chess game, my lord?" she questioned. "Wouldn't that rather be our first one?" The Earl laughed. "I would prefer it to be a common practice, my dear." Elizabeth fought her betraying blush with what she hoped was a carefree laugh. "Very well, my lord. I accept your terms." Before she finished speaking, she goaded her horse into action and gained a very slight lead. She could hear the Earl's answering laughter following her, as well as the pounding of his horse's hooves. She leaned over her mount's neck, urging it to greater speed. With a crow of delight, Elizabeth brought her horse to a slower pace as soon as she entered the tree line. "I beat you, my lord." "I think it was much more like a tie, my dear." "Now, my lord, do not be a sore loser. It is a fact that my horse's nose was clearly ahead of yours when we crossed the finish line." The Earl was laughing at her words. "Far be it from me to argue with a lady. Very well, you shall be white when we play this evening." Elizabeth laughed. Now I fear that I shall be trounced soundly. I am a far better horsewoman than a chess player." "I find that difficult to believe, my dear, as you are clearly a skilled strategist." Elizabeth felt a colour rise again at his veiled words, but forbore to comment, merely pulling on the reins to encourage her mount to head back towards the stables. After an awkward silence, they resumed a polite discussion of their day. She was relieved when the Earl excused himself soon after they dismounted. She was left with a considerable amount of the afternoon remaining. Time enough to search the room containing the previous Countess's belongings, she realized with delight. She changed out of her riding habit as quickly as possible, and dismissed her maid as soon as her hair was tidied.